So this is a special video considering the certain special date of a certain Marvel movie that came out a long time ago. As of now, when I'm recording this on April 29th, it's about maybe a few days away, but May the 3rd is the 20th anniversary of the 2002 Spider-Man movie. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years since this film came out. Any of you who have watched my channel for all these years, you know how much this film and this character means to me. I've done plenty of videos talking about this character and my love and admiration for it, as well as the following sequel, Spider-Man 2. I've covered in various videos my overall opinions on the character and the films and how I feel as opposed to other fans out there wanting to defend certain things and have been advocating for them. This film has shaped my imagination and who I am as a person ever since I saw it at 12 years old. I was head over heels in love with it when it came out, and in a lot of ways I still am to this day. And along the way I definitely drove a lot of people crazy. Kids in my class, even my parents. They told me many times that my obsession was unhealthy, and I'm sure that my dad probably would have preferred me to be more concerned with playing football. And I can even recall my mom rolling her eyes a few times. I know that she's watching this right now, and maybe my dad will watch it. If that ever bothered you, I apologize. You like what you like. I've already done a review of the first Spider-Man movie. I considered doing like a 20th anniversary edition video. I didn't really think that would be appropriate this time around. Maybe I'll do a commentary one day, like an audio commentary. In the case of this video, why not talk about the best scenes or certain moments or aspects of the original trilogy for Spider-Man, and how they overall play into Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker's journey at the end of No Way Home. The first moment that I want to talk about, the scene where Peter Parker is still crying over the loss of his uncle on the day of his graduation. The first movie portrays Uncle Ben and Aunt May as a couple that have been together for so many years, going through all their ups and downs, showing a deep love and care and respect for each other, along with Aunt May showing her confidence and trust in him that he will eventually find a way.
I love you, and Peter loves you. You're the most responsible man I've ever known. We've been down and out before, but somehow we survive.
It's a really small, normal moment between the two, but it gets the point across perfectly as to why they are so impactful on Peter Parker, because of who they are as people. When Peter tries to win money to buy a car out of arrogance, and rejecting Uncle Ben's words of wisdom on power and responsibility, he still feels a huge amount of guilt over what happened. Now, if you've seen the third movie, we all know that it didn't happen initially the way we thought it did. Nevertheless, though, it's still an important moment for Peter to learn. Any kid in his position would be really impressed and wowed by these extraordinary abilities that he has, especially if you consider yourself to be a social outcast or if you are a social outcast. Peter's reaction to the fight promoter not paying him the full amount of money that he was promised is perfectly reasonable, because the guy clearly has a lot more money than he's willing to give.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Yeah, I'd probably let the thief run past me if I were him. Not only that, but when Peter thinks back on the last conversation he had with Uncle Ben where he tells him, "Stop pretending to be my father," that I think hurts him a lot more, because, as he says to Aunt May,
I can't help thinking about the last thing I said to him. He tried to tell me something important, and I threw it in his face.
And by the way, if it really bothers you that he's crying on one of the biggest days of his life, knowing that his father figure, the only father figure he's had in his life, would have been there had he not died, loss is a horrible thing. I don't care how tough you say you are, no matter how much you recover from it, that pain never leaves you. Not completely, anyway. But it's after Aunt May's encouragement that he's able to realize that even though he wasn't able to save Uncle Ben, he has these extraordinary powers for a reason. Instead of using them to self-aggrandize his ego, he's going to use them in a form of love to help and to aid other people. With great power comes great responsibility. And the effect that Uncle Ben has on Peter Parker still follows him all the way up to No Way Home. Like in Spider-Man 3, when he realizes that the Sandman was responsible for killing his Uncle Ben. And that leads me to my other favorite moment in this trilogy, when he finally forgives Flint Marko for what he did. Because initially we're led to believe that Flint Marko just murdered him in cold blood, or at least that's how Peter sees it, as it was hinted when Aunt May tells him the story about how he proposed to her many years ago, that had he not passed away, they would have been married for 50 years. Aunt May still feels a little bit of awkwardness and some hurt over Peter's actions in the first movie, which he confessed to in Spider-Man 2 in a really great scene, which we'll talk about later. Being affected by the black suit in this movie, his anger is magnified, goes on a huge rampage in the subway, viciously beating Sandman to a pulp, covering him in sewer water, thinking that he killed him. Issues with Spider-Man 3 aside, it eventually leads to Sandman confessing to what happened the night Uncle Ben died. Peter, having heard his side of the story and looking at himself in the mirror of sorts, realizes that he's actually not that much better than him, and is finally able to say the words of, "I forgive you." Not only giving a sense of healing to Flint Marko, but for Peter himself, as he says to Tom in No Way Home, that it took him a long time to finally learn to get through that darkness. As far as the theme of forgiveness in Spider-Man 3, the execution, could have been handled a lot better in so many ways, but I do like the idea of forgiveness in this movie, especially when you see Peter go through all these things and learning to come to terms with what happened and how he manages to, in a way, rectify or at least reconcile with Harry in his dying moments. And you could say that in a way he did reconcile with Mary Jane, even though it wasn't really clear at the time, but according to No Way Home,
Took a while, but we made it work.
Yeah.
Yeah, me and MJ.
my MJ, it gets confusing here. Forgiveness is a really beautiful thing until we actually learn that we have to practice it and put it in action. When Peter says to Aunt May that he hurt MJ and he doesn't know what to do, and Aunt May says to him,
Start by doing the hardest thing. You forgive yourself.
that word of advice did kind of floor me, even though I didn't quite understand it at the time. Having gone through certain things in the last few years, it resonates with me on a much deeper level. Forgiving others is important, and that's one of the things that I think that this movie is able to convey beautifully in so many ways, the life lessons that it can offer people. You can debate about whether or not the execution of those ideas is well done or not, but again, I do like the idea of forgiveness in Spider-Man 3, and this scene alone is a prime example. As for Aunt May, I still think that Rosemary Harris is the best actress to play her. Not only does she look like the original Aunt May from the 60s Spider-Man comics, but she feels like an actually legitimate, caring, and loving mother figure to Peter Parker. Little things that she does, like in the first film when she wakes up and listens to Peter's indirect confession to MJ and closes her eyes with a big smile on her face, showing how proud she is of Peter, that he's finally opening his heart to her. I haven't seen one of those on your face since Mary Jane was here. Hey, you were supposed to be asleep. Every emotion that Rosemary Harris gives off as the character, one minute she can have you smile at her for just how caring and very wholesome she is, and then about 30 seconds later you can actually cry along with her and feel for her when she's remembering the death of her husband from 2 years prior. And it's in Spider-Man 2 with the relationship with her nephew is put to the test. When Peter finally is able to confess to her what happened the night Uncle Ben died, that scene, even then, when I saw this at 14 years old, I was crying, especially when he says,
I held his hand when he died.
to my knowledge, the editor for this movie, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. For the most part, he chose to not cut away from Tobey Maguire's performance because of how good he was. It goes on for maybe about a minute and a half or so, and when it finally cuts back to Aunt May, her look of appallment feels so authentic and genuine. Not only is some of that the best writing and directing on Sam Raimi's part and Alvin Sargent's part, but I think that it is some of the best acting that Tobey Maguire has ever done. And then finally, in the speech that Aunt May gives to him about heroism, to this day, it still warms my heart. A message that I think was applicable for Tom Holland's Peter Parker in No Way Home when he decides to leave MJ behind, but I think it's applicable to all of us ordinary people in regular life. We can all be a hero to somebody in some shape or form. It doesn't matter who you are in life or where your path is taking you. All of us have a heroic side deep down there somewhere. And it's that moment where after Peter is going through his existential crisis stuff, as he says in No Way Home, Aunt May's speech of heroism is what finally makes him realize that Spider-Man is too important to give up. And so he decides that it's the right thing to do, and he has to make one final sacrifice eventually in being with Mary Jane. But on that note, one of the other best scenes in the movie is when he saves the girl from the burning building when he doesn't have his powers. Spider-Man 2 is arguably the best superhero movie ever made next to The Dark Knight. Peter Parker's personal life is literally against the ropes, and he is being pounded and pounded into the ground. MJ is moving on to marry John Jameson. He's failing in school, he's behind on his rent, keeps getting fired and unfired by Jonah Jameson, and Harry gets even more resentful towards Peter because he still keeps taking pictures of Spider-Man, who Harry believes killed his father, Norman. And when Peter loses his powers due to his mental breakdown, he decides to leave it all behind and have a life of his own. Unfortunately, the crime rate in New York City skyrockets to about 75%, according to one Daily Bugle headline. And when he sees a burning building, he finally decides to go in there and do something about it. Sequels tend to repeat certain things, because this is clearly a reference to the fire scene in the first film where he fights the Green Goblin, but this is a repeat for a reason. It's the opposite of that situation. It makes you as a viewer go, oh no, he's not Spider-Man, but he's still a good person and he still has that drive to help other people. And when he saves that little girl barely by the skin of his teeth, almost kind of like Indiana Jones in that way, it makes it all the more riveting. And I think this scene is very integral, because I've heard some people argue that the scene is very tacked on and that you could delete the entire thing and it would make the film a lot better. I completely disagree with that notion. I've also heard that some people have argued that Maguire's a good enough actor that he could have just sold it without having to lose his powers. I agree with that, but you wouldn't have had a scene like this where it gives him a proper character arc to go through, where he realizes that he has to be Spider-Man as it's too important to give up, and that people look up to him as a hero after all. If it contrives good character building, I think it's perfectly excusable. Another aspect of this trilogy that I think is really in a lot of ways the heart and soul of it all is Peter's romantic relationship with Mary Jane, or the romantic interest dynamic, whatever you want to call it. Both Toby and Kirsten, I think, are very underappreciated as a romantic couple on screen. I often hear a lot of people say that Andrew and Emma are their favorite Spider-Man romantic couple in film because of their natural chemistry. Well, okay, maybe so. For reasons I've stated before, I don't really see much to their relationship. If you want to know my full thoughts, you could check my reviews on The Amazing Spider-Man, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But I think the way they established them as a romantic couple, Toby and Kirsten's, Peter and MJ, it was more drawn out from the beginning of the first film towards the end of the second film, where you saw eventually how they were able to grow and get to know each other and having actual conversations with each other. As I stated in one of my previous videos, it feels like a natural couple. Whoever you're interested in romantically, you take your time to get to know them. You don't just jump into things overnight and everything's right as rain. It doesn't work that way. I can tell you from experience, I've had that similar thing happen. Peter's indirect confession to MJ about how he feels about her gives us a really good picture as to why he's in love with her, especially since I've heard some people say that they have no idea why he likes her so much. Well, wouldn't you have a thing for her if you saw her sitting next to you in your classroom? I know I would. And I know, at 12 years old, I had a thing for her instantaneously. But it's not just that moment, it's other moments that he has with her throughout the first film, where he doesn't judge her for being a waitress, and he actually encourages her to follow her dreams of being an actress on Broadway. Nobody else, as far as we can tell, has ever given her that kind of encouragement. The complete opposite of her father, Flash, and Harry. I get why that she falls in love with Peter after all. Women at a certain point can't always be dating the bad boys. They need someone who's sweet and kind and caring and who will always be there for them whenever they need them. And as for eventually how they end up together, I've had to watch Spider-Man 2 a few times in order to understand like what the arc is basically. Peter tries really hard to keep the promise of being her friend even though his superhero duties are getting in the way. That's what's causing his powers to fade out. And when he finally decides to make that sacrifice of letting it go completely, and eventually he's able to tell her how he really feels and his true identity to her, but not expecting anything in return, is what's able to help him let it go completely and be the heroic figure that he needs, and as a result, he's rewarded. Initially, he didn't think that it was possible, because after he's able to give up his powers and make an effort to show her, look, I'm making an effort now, we can be together.
I'm different. Punch me, I bleed.
Absolutely love that line. And eventually, after she has that upside down kiss with John Jameson, she does not have the same type of connection with him that she has with Peter. And a lot of the times, you don't get it right on the first try, which leads to the cafe scene, but he ends up pushing her away. You could say that it's a little bit obnoxious where it's like, oh, are they? No, wait, no, yeah, no. But Peter actually had a reason for thinking that it could work, because he stopped being Spider-Man, he lost his powers, and his great love was no longer in danger. We all have that moment in life where we just want to have what we want. Eventually, you're just gonna wipe your hands and go, that's it. I'm done. It could easily come across as Peter being selfish, but it's done in a way where we as the audience root for him to be happy. And that scene in the cafe
takes place just when Peter Parker has realized that as much as he has given away his outfit, has chased after Mary Jane Watson and promised her that he'd be there, that really he never had a right to make that promise.
And in that respect, that connects with me in a lot of ways, especially with certain relationships that I've had in the past, because I have a tendency to really give myself and give 110% in every situation that I'm in. Sometimes with the wrong people and with a certain person who is not really the right fit for me. Now that I'm much farther removed away, I realize that I never really had a right to put all my eggs in one basket. And when he's finally able to confess to MJ and not expect anything in return, she ultimately decides to follow her heart and be with him. And I think it's for a good reason, because Peter, after getting beaten down so many times in life, he deserves to be happy. He deserves to have a good thing in his life. And MJ makes the choice for herself. So, in a way, there's really nothing he can do about it. And it was never going to work had she not known he was Spider-Man. If he tried to hide it from her, it would have made the relationship really messy. And the ending where he swings off hooting and hollering over the streets of New York as she looks on, knowing that this is not going to be an easy adventure for her. It's chilling, it's thrilling, it's exciting, but it's also kind of sad, knowing that there's going to be some really hard times coming their way. As for hardships, let's talk about Norman Osborn and his son Harry. The connection that Peter has with these two people, it turns out to be, especially in light of No Way Home, the one watershed moment that Peter wishes that he could go back and change or fix. He's already come to terms by that point with being bitten by a spider and accepting what happened with Uncle Ben, even though I think he does wish that he could have handled it somewhat differently. Norman Osborn was basically the crux of Peter's problems in his life. Losing his friendship with Harry and even losing his friend who died trying to save his life. The Osborns and the Parkers, it's like the Capulets and the Montagues. That was a Seinfeld reference in case you didn't get what I was doing there. I don't know where that came from, but I just decided to do it on a whim. I don't know. Norman Osborn is played superbly by Willem Dafoe, who is not only one of the best actors alive, but one of the creepiest actors alive. As I'm sure you all know, Willem Dafoe kept pestering Sam Raimi of playing this part. Raimi didn't initially want to cast him, but he decided to go for it after certain people like Nicolas Cage and John Malkovich were up for the job. Nicolas Cage is the Green Goblin. No thanks. But not only does Dafoe look evil, he actually does in his own way look like a goblin. I would have been kind of curious to see if they could do some kind of a motion capture work if they were willing to bring him back again, because that's another thing. The costume for the Green Goblin, everyone loves to hate on that costume, and I think the helmet look is a little bit silly and kind of ridiculous, but as far as the alternative that they had in mind, where it was like a prosthetic makeup effect, it would have been so restricting for Dafoe, and I think that would have been a lot worse. Especially when you look at the comic book counterpart, it's a no-win situation there. How do you exactly translate that look to live action? Somehow he has a mask that's in the same synchronization with his eyes, his eyebrows, and his mouth. Maybe nowadays you can do a motion capture effect. Even so, I still think that's a really, really tricky ground to walk on. Dafoe's performance as the Green Goblin is perfectly hammy in all the right ways. The line delivery, the evil cackle that's even listed on WatchMojo.com's top 10 evil laughs of all time, and he's able to perfectly show just how much of a negative influence he is on Peter Parker's life, no matter what universe he's in, whether it's Tobey's universe or even Tom's universe when he ends up killing Aunt May, and even targets Tobey's Aunt May when he learns Peter's identity. The heart, Osborn. First we attack his heart. Instruct him in the matters of loss and pain. Make him suffer. Make him wish he were dead. I could listen to Dafoe's Goblin performance forever, and I could do those lines until the day I die, and I guess that sounds kind of wrong. The prime example is the mirror scene, where it's probably the biggest example of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of story, and Stan Lee was a big fan of that story and used that as a main inspiration for many of the characters he created, including the Incredible Hulk.
Bringing you what you've always wanted. Power beyond your wildest dreams, and it's only the beginning.
To say what you won't, to do what you can't, to remove those in your way. But as cheesy and hammy as he was, he brings a really good amount of humanity to the character. In the comics, he's portrayed as a very cold businessman who doesn't really seem to care about much, unless in certain moments where he allows his caring side to come out when Harry's brought up. In these movies, he's more of a normal guy who doesn't really know how to be a father to Harry, and as a result, he kind of buried himself into his work after losing his wife, and unfortunately it caused him to miss out on certain things with Harry and never really was able to connect with Harry in the way that Harry wanted to. And then when he finally meets Peter Parker, who shares a similar interest in science like he has, Harry has some jealousy in regards to that because Peter's able to do things that Harry can't do very well, which eventually leads to the tension between him and Peter throughout the trilogy. Norman goes out of his way to give him the kind of advice that he feels is necessary for Peter, especially after losing Uncle Ben. Even then, when he says to Harry at the graduation,
"It's not the first time I've been proven wrong."
Father of the Year, that's all I have to say. Showing Peter respect for wanting to find his own work instead of relying on other people to help him. Eventually, it leads to his sense of betrayal on his part when he finds out Peter's secret. After loving him like a son, naturally, I think he'd be really upset over that reveal. This information Norman is able to use in order to get the upper hand on Peter, attacking his heart, as the Goblin persona says to Norman, showing just exactly how much of the arch nemesis he is for Spider-Man, just like the Joker is for the Batman. And the final confrontation that they have, as Sam Raimi said in one interview, they fight to the death by night, and that scene, still to this day, makes me shake with dread in all the right ways. Even at 12 years old when I first saw this movie, I was horrified. I looked over at my dad, and he watches some violent stuff sometimes, like war movies and everything, like Saving Private Ryan. He shook and went, oh man. Even my mom had the same reaction when she saw it on DVD several months after that. But it's Norman's dying moment that leaves a permanent scar on Peter's psyche. It's this moment that Tobey's Peter was able to finally, in a way, correct in No Way Home what he didn't do. When he saw Tom Holland's Peter about to stab Norman, Tobey's Peter immediately jumps in and stops him, just like Andrew's Peter was able to save MJ and, in a way, spiritually saving Gwen Stacy. There's a lot of other great scenes or moments that I could talk about, like Sandman waking up for the first time in Spider-Man 3, showing us just how much potential he really could have had as a character. The CGI and the musical score by Christopher Young in that scene alone, beautiful doesn't quite cover it. The action scenes that we see from like the train fight in Spider-Man 2, the bank heist scene, which if you watch the extended versions of those fights, I think they're a lot more exciting in many ways. The wrestling scene between Spider-Man and Macho Man Randy Savage or Bonesaw.
I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes of heat time!
The small appearances from Bruce Campbell in all three movies as the fighting announcer, the usher, and the maitre d' at the restaurant. Shoelace, you might wanna, can I help you? Oh, I'm sorry, sir. No one will be seated after the doors are closed. It helps maintain the illusion. Or like when Peter discovers his powers for the first time saying,
Up and away, Web! Shazam!
can you imagine if they had Tobey Maguire as Billy Batson instead of Zachary Levi? That would have been hilarious. But I still think Zachary Levi is a good choice for that character. Or small moments like the one he has with Ursula, the landlord's daughter, who gives him a piece of chocolate cake. After getting so crapped on by so many people, someone actually does something good for him and some nice thing for him. It's such a small moment that I've learned to appreciate it much more over time as I've gotten older. Small things like that, you would not really see that often in a comic book movie these days. It feels very much like an independent film. In fact, that's what I think the first two films in particular feel like in a lot of ways, like an indie film. And I think Sam Raimi in a lot of ways has a strong affinity for that since he's very artistic in his own way as a filmmaker. I've never really seen Evil Dead, but just from what I've seen of it, he has a really certain style, and it's almost like a perfect marriage between his style and the Spider-Man character. Not to say that there aren't good choice directors out there for a Spider-Man movie, but Sam Raimi I still think remains the best one. But you also can't talk about these movies and not even give a slight mention to J.K. Simmons as Jonah Jameson. Whatever you think of the other parts of this trilogy, there's one thing that I think even the detractors can agree on. J.K. Simmons is perfect casting as Jonah Jameson. Straight off the page, not just in looks, but in mannerisms and in personality. And I didn't even read comics until after I saw the first movie, but when I started reading Spider-Man comics, I instantly could hear J.K. Simmons' voice playing through my head. A bald guy with no mustache, and someone who shows up in the Farmers Insurance commercials as of lately, he's perfect for that character. And if you still doubt me, he won an Oscar for Whiplash. That should tell you something. Other funny scenes like the elevator scene where you have that one guy who I guess is played by Hal Rudnick, I don't know the actor's name, talking about the costume riding up in the crotch a little bit. I love that scene to pieces. Or like scenes with the woman playing the Spider-Man theme on her violin, and the raindrops keep falling on my head sequence. But the last two things I'll talk about is from Spider-Man 2. The teacher-student relationship that Peter has with Otto Octavius, who, for all intents and purposes, is basically what Tony Stark was to Tom Holland's Peter Parker. Toby had a respect for Norman Osborn until the Thanksgiving dinner scene, but Otto I think was a lot more in line with who Peter was as a person. Not just in science, but also his moral values, but also someone who had what Peter strongly desired deep down, to have a loving wife that supported him in a really extraordinary circumstance. And in a way, I think it's a hopeful sign for Peter that he actually can have both, and that's actually what ends up happening later on. And despite Otto feeling a little bit of disdain towards Peter for not being the best student in Dr. Connor's class, getting to know Peter, naturally he comes to respect him and actually like him. Ah, Rosie, I love this boy. In fact, their first meeting together is called back to in No Way Home, which, that scene alone is my favorite moment in the entire thing.
You're all grown up.
How are you?
Trying to do better.
Hit so hard in the feels, it's not even funny. And I think I could see why Toby's Peter would have more of a respect for Otto, because Otto is basically the victim. I mean, both him and Norman were victims, but I think Otto was clearly more aware of what he was doing and had more control over it, and he had more of a deeper connection with him than Norman ever had with Peter, because Otto was willing to listen to reason. And if Toby's Peter had said the whole "sometimes to do what's right we have to be steady" thing to Norman, Norman was a little too disconnected from that kind of stuff, and matters of the heart is not something that I would see that kind of guy be open to talking about. Otto, I think he would be more willing to discuss that stuff. I mean, if any indication, he tells Peter, if you want to get a woman to fall in love with you, feed her poetry. Not only that, him as the villain in Spider-Man 2, the villain-hero relationship they have is pretty standard and basic in the fact that they barely have one at all. He doesn't want to kill Spider-Man out of revenge for ruining his experiment or the death of his wife, and doesn't have a similar thing that Norman has where he learns that Spider-Man is Peter and feels betrayed. He just wants to finish his experiment, and Spider-Man just keeps getting in the way to reach his goal. The only time he actually goes after Spider-Man is when Harry requests him to bring Spider-Man to him so he could kill him. So he sees Spider-Man as just a means to an end in order to get what he wants, the tritium. And the fight scenes that he and Spider-Man have together make for the best action sequence in any Spider-Man movie to this day. The train scene. Everything about this scene is just pure perfection. The movements that Spider-Man has, dodging the tentacles, him ducking like he's playing limbo, fighting on the side of the train, swinging on the pole, coming out of the window, webbing himself back onto the train. I've watched those YouTube clips, I don't even know how many times. Probably too many. But it leads to what is probably by far my favorite scene in not only this whole movie, but in this entire trilogy, is when he manages to stop the train when he doesn't have his mask on. Some people have complained about how he takes his mask off a lot in this movie, but frankly, it allows us to see what he's feeling in that moment. But when he uses all of his strength to stop the train screaming out in agony, not only is that a tense scene, but it also makes you think as the viewer that he might actually die from this. And that's probably why he had the mask off, because more than likely he thought that this was going to be his dying moment, and if anything, he'd probably want his Aunt May to identify the body if needed. The general public of New York City is very mixed on him, and they're not really sure what to think of Spider-Man, but when they see what he does for them, they realize that, oh, wait a minute, he is a hero. And they have an even deeper respect for him because of how young he is. Like that one character says, he's just a kid, he's no older than my son. What I also really like is that not only are they grateful for what he's done, Peter Parker's not some public figure like Bruce Wayne is. Like if this were Batman, people would obviously be really shocked and go, it's Bruce Wayne. None of them say, oh, it's Peter Parker. They have no idea who he is. He's just some anonymous random New Yorker to them. And the little pact that the passengers have when that one kid, who is actually played by Tobey Maguire's younger brother.
We won't tell nobody.
They won't tell anybody that they saw his face, but obviously word would get out to the general public of what he did. And in terms of the trilogy, it makes sense as to why in the third film, he's finally getting appreciated for his heroic efforts. No words spoken from Tobey Maguire in this scene, but his subtle facial expressions and the way he looks at all the other passengers looking back at him, the musical score, the direction, everything about that scene is just pure
perfection.
Enough said. Oh, and I do like Stan Lee's cameo in Spider-Man 3 when he says, "I guess one person can make a difference." I just had to throw that in there. Oh, I guarantee you he had a huge grin on his face when he saw Spider-Man No Way Home from up above. There's a lot more that I just realized that I would want to talk about, but for time purposes I can't because I'll be here all day. I've talked about it before in other videos. If you want to know, you can just go check them out there on my channel. But this was just my own way of paying respect to this trilogy that started 20 years ago, and as I said earlier, it's still hard to believe that it was that long ago, because in some ways it still feels like yesterday. Seeing how it all culminated in recent months with Spider-Man No Way Home, with all three eras of Spider-Man joining together on film, something that we all dreamed about as fans, like in fan fiction, but we never thought were possible. You could thank God for Marvel Studios for being able to pull that off. Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and everybody else involved, they created a set of films that still to this day resonate with so many people, including me, and I don't think that there will ever be a Spider-Man film as good as the first two, especially the first one. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say it, and some of you might not be shocked, some of you might be, but the first Spider-Man movie is my favorite movie of all time. It may not be perfect, but it's perfect for me. Even 20 years later, the influence it had on cinema is still felt. The way it gave hope to people in a post-9/11 world, the amount of money it made at the box office. By today's standards, it wouldn't really seem that impressive, but back then, it was huge. $114 million in one weekend alone. The upside down kiss has been referenced plenty of times in pop culture. The opening sequence is practically iconic, with Danny Elfman's score especially, and the fact that the MCU has acknowledged that era of Spider-Man, that should tell you all you need to know. And this film, along with its sequels, did set the stage for what we've gotten right now in the last 10 years or so, along with other franchises as well, like the original X-Men or the Christian Bale Batman. This one really set the stage for the MCU, where you can take a superhero movie seriously, but you can also have fun with it at the same time. And even though Spider-Man 4 never really came to fruition, the fact that we got to see Tobey Maguire come back at least one more time in No Way Home, that just meant the world to me in so many ways. And if the rumors are true, if we are getting a Spider-Man 4, if there's even the slightest chance that it could come to fruition, Tobey Maguire did say in a recent interview that he doesn't necessarily want to close the chapter, but he wanted to provide certain resolutions for his character in No Way Home. Just when I thought that he might be done with the character, that quote alone tells me, oh, maybe he's not done yet. Either way, it was great to see him back again. He's actually getting more work now as a result. Maybe this could be the start of a career resurgence, who knows? Believe it or not, he's actually supposed to play Charlie Chaplin later this year in this movie called Babylon. I wouldn't have pictured him as Charlie Chaplin, but hey, I'm all for it. Give this guy more work. He deserves it. Anyway, that's all I gotta say in this video about these three films and No Way Home. I'm sure at some point later down the line I'll have another excuse to talk about them, but thank you guys so much for watching this video, and whatever your thoughts are in this trilogy, if you have like a favorite moment or a favorite scene that sticks out in your mind, feel free to tell me in the comments what it is. I'm sure that you guys have plenty of stuff to say, whether or not you like these movies or not. Either way, let's try to have a civilized discussion, because it can get a little heated when it comes to the Spider-Man movies. It almost kind of reminds me of the Star Wars fandom, which don't get me started on that. Let's just have a really healthy discussion, and let's be happy that we get to celebrate Spider-Man's 20th birthday, the 2002 Spider-Man movie, I mean. 20 years is a long time. Not that long, but it's long enough. Let's make this a special one. Shall we? Thanks again, guys, for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are, and I'll see you guys in the next one.